Well, bringing us back to Washington, you are, of course, the chair of the Budget Committee in the Senate, and it's interesting, not to get too far in the weeds for the people who aren't from Washington, but this is a city and a nation that's lurched from crisis to crisis over simply developing a budget, simply making an agreement over tax and spending. We've had government shutdowns. We've nearly defaulted on the debt. This has been the most rancorous period that you could imagine over these kinds of issues. You waltz in quietly and craft an agreement with the leading conservative thinker and the Budget Committee chair in the House, Paul Ryan. You cut through that hostile environment and came to an agreement. Some people say it wasn't big enough. Nevertheless, it was an agreement. Tell us how you did it.
Well, I think the most important thing that I did and that Paul Ryan did was to come to the table willing to listen to each other. And that hasn't happened a lot in Washington, D.C. over the last several years. People go out, they give their political speeches, they put on their battle armor, they say why the other side is bad, but they haven't really sat down to listen to each other. So Paul Ryan and I sat down immediately, like we passed this on an evening, and the next morning he and I were having breakfast. And really what we had to do was something that doesn't happen very often here, was get to know each other. Somebody from a different political party with very different visions, and my goal was to find out what makes him tick. What does he feel passionately about? Because I knew coming out of this that both of us were going to have to feel like we won something. Obviously you have to compromise, but he needed a story about what he won, and I needed a story about what I won. So before I could do that, I had to find out what was most important to him. And secondly, I think establish a trust, which it was sorely lacking here in Washington, D.C. at the time, that we were not going to violate our conversations with each other. Too often in politics, people use what they hear to go slam them later. And we had to agree not to do that, but also know that that agreement was going to stay in place. So, it took a little bit for us to do that.
But it had something to do with the 3 F's, I'm told. Family,
Correct.
fish,
Correct.
and football.
Right,
Okay.
Exactly. I mean,
the family part we can skip.
well,
let's go straight to the fish
but
and the football.
Interestingly, both Paul Ryan and I had tragedies happen to our fathers that impacted our lives, and we shared that, and I think...
Talk about that.
Well, obviously he lost his father when he was very young. My father was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis when I was 15. Literally had to quit working, and my mother, who was raising 7 children, had to go back to work. So we both had a huge challenge when we were teenagers that we had to overcome, and that was something that we shared in common. But I had to find something. I have 4 brothers, so I get how this works. You gotta, talk the language, and I fish, and he fishes.
You salmon fish,
I
correct?
salmon fish. He fishes for some weird fish that they fish for. I never did get that. But I mean, I don't even know if he eat what he catches. We eat what I catch. But anyway, we could kind of share stories about that. But probably the thing that kept us laughing the most was our football teams. Now, I'm from Washington State. Nobody was talking about the Seahawks way back when we started this. But his team, sorry, Tammy, kind of got kicked out of the season early on because your quarterback was injured. So I would just give Paul grief about his football team. And of course, my team kept doing better and better. And it was kind of the go-to laugh that we could share. And interestingly, I'll just tell all of you that because that became a common bond, after we reached this agreement, worked it through Congress, I called the Seahawks, and our quarterback signed a jersey to Paul Ryan, which I presented to him. Now, this was a month before the Super Bowl, when now that jersey is really worth a lot. So he owes me now. But yeah, no, so you have to establish some things that aren't what you're talking on budget and numbers and those kinds of things, but really who this other person is you have to work with.
So I emailed Paul, and he got right back, which means he thinks highly of you. And he explained, we had to build trust with one another over a few months. We had several discussions, and none wound up in the paper the next day. Basically, we listened to each other, got to know each other, learned we could work and trust one another. We are about as far apart philosophically as it gets, but our personalities were able to overcome that. So 2 takeaways from that in terms of tips for negotiating in a hostile environment. One is privacy, keep it private, sounds like, and the other is, as you were talking about, personality.
Yeah. I think finding something in common with the other person so you have kind of a go-to when things get tough is really important and not done often enough in negotiations. I think in business leaders know the same thing. Find out what the other person's passion is and how you can help them be a winner, as the same as you're being a winner by telling a story that is winning for them. And that trust level is so important.
And were there times when it got tough for you
There
in
were
the process?
Obviously, you know, he and I come from miles apart. He's passionate about issues I'm not, and we had to learn to listen to each other. I live in a great spot in the state of Washington on Whidbey Island. I look out my window where I fish onto Puget Sound and the mountains, and I remember looking out at the mountains one day and thinking, thank God I'm not in Washington, D.C. I can just calm down right here. But, you know, I think he had to do the same thing. Much of our negotiation was on a phone, talking to each other from our homes. So it wasn't all in a, you know, solid little room with a bunch of reporters outside. It was really taking advantage of knowing each other in their own place.
And knowing you would get heat from your own allies.
You know, and it is something that he and I talked about. It was, both of us knew that as we compromised, that our best supporters were not going to be real happy with what we compromised with. He and I could sit in a room and reach an agreement, but the hardest part came next when we had to go back and tell our own caucuses and our own constituents that we had compromised and then ask them to vote for it.
Let me ask you just one policy question, then we'll move on. It's a dinner. We don't want to get too deep here, but, you know, there are a lot of folks who are concerned that if entitlements aren't reformed, that is Social Security and Medicare, you know, the costs are exploding on both fronts, that there isn't going to be the money to do the things we need to do to build the economy, like infrastructure. What is your sense on that?
Well, I think that there's the other side of it, which is that unless we do tax reform that brings more revenue in to help solve our deficit and not just our revenue deficit, but our deficit in infrastructure and our deficit in education, that we can't come to a balanced approach. So I think it all has to be on the table to be able to reach an agreement on those issues.
So you grew up in a small town in Washington. Your dad was a manager of a store. You were one of 7. You're a twin. And as you mentioned earlier, he got sick, and your mom really struggled. Our next guest has a similar story to tell, which is interesting. Talk about how that shaped you.
Well, you know, when I grew up in a small town. It was 1,000 people, so it was a very small community. And my dad ran the dime store. Everybody knew him. He was president of the Lions Club, and you know, we participated. We didn't have a lot of money, but you know, it was a small community. Everybody supported each other. All of a sudden, when I'm a teenager, 15 is not an easy age, my dad literally was in a wheelchair, and you know, we had to figure out how we were going to go to college. My mom had to go back to a community college and get some skills to get a job, to pay, not only to put food on the table, but to help my dad get through all of his medical bills. What I remember so much was, thank God my country's there for me, because it was Pell Grants and student loans that allowed all 7 of us to go to college. It was a program at the community college that allowed my mom to get an accounting degree and get a job. We were on food stamps for a while. Those were my friends and my neighbors who were contributing to a government that helped me survive. And I proudly say that all 7 of us kids graduated from college, and all of us are giving back, me as a United States Senator.
And you had a very unlikely political rise. For people not familiar with your background in the room, you were the mom in tennis shoes, ran for Senate in 1992. Before that, you were just a state legislator, and before that, you really launched your political career by a battle over preschool funding.
I taught preschool, and our state legislature tried to take the funding away from this preschool program. Tough economic times back in the early 80s, and I went to my state capital I'd never been to the state capitol before, but I drove down there 100 miles with my 2 little kids in the car and started asking why they were going to take away this preschool program that was so important for our community and kids. And a state legislator looked down at me and he said, "You can't make a difference, you're just a mom in tennis shoes." That is literally why I'm here. I was so mad that he thought that a mom in tennis shoes shouldn't have a voice in our government, that I went home and organized thousands of moms to go back to the state capitol and fight him.
That's what I'm especially curious about. A lot of women would have said, you know, I mean, just that would have been a moment of defeat for them, and they just would have scurried back to their corner, but somehow it ignited you.
Well, you know, I've always believed that you can sit at home and gripe about it, or you can go out and make a difference. And I am not happy yelling at my television. I am much happier being in the room and participating in the discussion and getting something out of it.
And you even in your races for office, you were afraid to ask people for money. I mean, you were uncomfortable asking people for money. So you had a garage sale.
We did. Oh God. So yeah, I came from a very low-income family. We didn't have much. So for me, asking people for money, I figured they didn't have much either. How could I ask them for this? And so my husband and I did a garage sale, and we collected all our stuff. My daughter sold cookies we made. I mean, we lost money because my husband kept giving things away to people who didn't have stuff. And you know, so I figured, well, God, I'm gonna have to ask people. So I got on the phone and I learned that people like to invest in somebody they believe in, and they like to be asked. So it was a really important lesson.
And so kind of moving forward here, you've pursued a style that is very not out front. Is there a political reason for that? Is there a rhyme or reason?
I just feel that I get more done and accomplish more if I'm just doing the job and doing the work and fighting for what I believe in.
But doesn't it help your career if you're on a Sunday talk show? Or talking to Andrea?
Well, I love Andrea. I like being on television when I want to help people understand what we are doing. I don't like being on television so much to be an opponent of somebody else. That to just go on and say a talking point so that they can say a talking point, to me, doesn't promote the things I really care about. Solving those problems and then going out and gathering support for them by telling people about it, to me, is how I accomplish this.
So they're giving me, I only have a couple more questions. One is, Olympia Snow, who has also come to our events and talks about her frustration and is leaving as a result of her frustration. But you're running again. You don't feel that same level of frustration?
I cannot go home and yell at the television. I mean, literally, if we give up as women in participating in this because it's too frustrating, we are handing it over to other people who would be very happy to have that power. So I think it's really important that we step outside of ourselves and have the courage and don't let the little things get to you and fight for what you believe in.
And finally, a political question. 2016, do you think Hillary will run? And do you see any potential serious opposition to her?
Well, I think 2016 on the Democratic side, I think Hillary has a tremendous resume. I was really fortunate. She served in the Senate with me, and I saw a very hardworking, passionate person who understood the issues and went out and what she fought for, and I think that's a great resume to run the country with.
So, but what's your bet? Does she run?
Fortunately, I'm not from Las Vegas. I don't place bets, but I do fight for what I believe in.